Okay, so here's the next knowledge dump. What I want to talk about today is design patterns. Design patterns are something we use in our toolkit as engineers to be able to take an idea of how we would like to build an application and funnel it into a common pattern of how we organize our code and how we actually create relationships in our projects. Most common ones for mobile development can be MVVM, VIPER, Coordinator, and MVC. For a lot of beginners, you'll notice that people like to bring up MVC quite a bit. MVC stands for Model View Controller. This is a design pattern where you organize your code in a way where you have a view, and that's the part that the user is going to interact with. Then you have a controller, which is actually controlling that view and recording those interactions. And then the model is sort of a mold of your objects. It represents your objects that are going to be flowing as data coming in and out of your application or throughout your application. Then you have the MVVM design pattern, which is kind of the hotness lately with mobile development or Swift and Swift UI. With that pattern, it is model, view, view, model. And with that design pattern, we essentially have model is the same concept. It's kind of a mold. It's the data that's like flowing throughout your project or flowing up and down. Like you may have the concept of a user or concept of some kind of object that's used around your app, and that's the model. Then you have the view, which is the same thing as before. We have this view that the user sees. It's what you see when you're interacting with an application, and it kind of is in charge of like receiving those interactions from the user. Then you have view model, which essentially acts as a layer that is listening into the view. It's kind of like view controller, but it's listening in for these things and tapping into network managers and other things that you may use. Typically, people are using a singleton pattern with this, but there's other methods for how to deal with the view model. So MVVM is model, view, view model. Then finally you have VIPER. VIPER is one of the most complicated ones. A lot of applications out there think that they need to use a VIPER architecture. Most of the time they don't. It's just seems really like a good idea to use this architecture at first, but an application, in my opinion, needs to be pretty big in order to utilize this pattern and reap the full benefits. But the VIPER pattern is view, interactor, presenter, entity, and router. With this design pattern, like I said, it's pretty complicated and most applications think that they need to use it. But what is nice about it is I like to think of it as sort of a set. You think about a movie set when you have a sort of a director, you have the stage, and you have someone in charge of this, someone in charge of that. You have like an assistant and everything like that. So VIPER is sort of like that. You can think of the view as sort of the stage. You can think of the interactor as someone who is like interacting, going from one spot to another, or in the world of app development, the interactor is actually communicating with a lot of the different managers you might have, like a network manager to make network calls to a given API, or it may actually be the boundary that's communicating with all of your other data-driven objects. Then you have the presenter. The presenter might be sort of a director, or maybe they're the person behind the camera. They're the ones that are making sure that we're actually looking at the right things. And so the presenter is kind of in charge of making sure that anytime there's business logic or calculations that need to happen, it's doing those things. It's communicating with the interactor, or it's communicating with the view. So it's kind of in charge of like receiving some information. I'd say it's more like an assistant director. And then the director is kind of the router, because the router is basically saying, okay, we need to go from here to here. These are the bits of information that need to communicate between different routers, because in VIPER, every single flow that you have essentially has its own VIPER layout. It can go even deeper than that if you want it to. And then entity is a lot like what we think about when we were talking about model before. It's sort of the mold of our data that's flowing throughout the application. So yeah, that's another knowledge dump for you for architecture and some design patterns. I'll do another video on more of the driven development patterns, like behavior driven development and coordinator patterns and domain driven development as well. I think those are like really important, especially for developers and engineers that are trying to take their knowledge to the next level. But anyway, thanks for listening.